Yeah, I'm just gonna shoot straight with you with the Red 9 right now. Resident Evil 5, not even outside looking in on this list. Resident Evil 6 has a better chance of making it into the definitive 4 Resident Evil games than 5 does. In celebration of Capcom's very well received, the latest addition to their genre-defining survival horror series with Resident Evil Requiem, today it is our job to sit down and figure out what the 4 big Resident Evil video games are. Out of the experiments, the successes, the failures, the highs and lows, which 4 Resident Evil games best define what the series is and what it's contributed to gaming as a whole. And, as always, everyone's measure of greatness when it comes to a Mount Rushmore conversation for any topic, it comes down to personal preference, personal experiences. What do you weigh over the other in terms of deciding what makes it into those 4 coveted slots? Today, we're looking at the following criteria. First up is impact. What did the game do for the video game landscape at the time of release? Secondly, pretty simple and straightforward, just straight up quality. Is the game good, actually? For many, considering how old Resident Evil is as a series, they would also consider hold-upness in this category, but I'm an adult. I can deal with unconventional controls. Any game is playable if you try hard enough. Oh, but does it hold up today? Get out of my face with that. That's not important. And lastly, in making our selections for the 4 defining Resident Evil games, a bit of Resident Evil specific criteria. What role does the game play in the series? Because Resident Evil as a franchise has seen numerous different eras, very distinct from one another. So our selections for today should best represent what the series can be when firing on all cylinders and taking into account what the franchise represents as a whole and the different faces it has had over the years. So what is our first selection for the top 4 definitive Resident Evil games? Well, we should start with the obvious one, Resident Evil Remake. It may not be the actual physical game that started it all, but Resident Evil Remake for the GameCube is what many people point to as the most Resident Evil in a lot of ways, because it had the hindsight of the PlayStation 1 trilogy when coming in to revisit the structure and general atmosphere of that first defining survival horror adventure, and was able to reinvent it for a modern audience and set the standard of what Resident Evil was moving forward. So to me, it is important to mention that we are not crediting Resident Evil Remake with being that genre-defining game. It is, however, a game that set a standard for a practice that would live well beyond the GameCube and lives to this day. Resident Evil Remake, for the longest time, was the standard of what was expected out of a remake. Because not only did this remake come in with a new generation of hardware behind it to create what I still believe is one of the best looking games ever made, it also recontextualized so many things, brought new surprises, and subverted expectations of returning players by introducing the Crimson Head enemies. And I think there's no better example of Remake leaning much more into the terror and horror of that Spencer Mansion than the new introduction to that storyline, Lisa Trevor. Yeah, Lisa Trevor, the disturbed, imprisoned enemy that you see screaming out in pain and anguish in the later portions of that game, completely absent from the original. That is a Remake Original Edition. So while Resident Evil Remake for the GameCube may not be the influential game that started everything on the PlayStation 1, it stands on its own and has its own strengths compared to that first game, and today stands as a wonderful introduction to what Resident Evil can be, and it is absolutely still worth playing today. You can get over the tank controls. You can. So Resident Evil Remake defined what a remake could be for the gaming landscape and was the bar of comparison that pretty much any other remake was compared to. It's why something like Twin Snakes on the same console was viewed so unfavorably by many people. And funnily enough, Resident Evil as a series also set the standard for a modern way to look at remakes with the next selection here, Resident Evil 2. The remake from 2019. Before Resident Evil 2 Remake, something like Ocarina of Time for the 3DS, or Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy, those were viewed as remakes. After Resident Evil 2 remake. Yeah, that Ocarina of Time remake is no longer viewed as interesting, good enough, or what people expect out of a remake, because Resident Evil 2 took that OG PS1 Resident Evil 2 game and truly reimagined it for a modern audience. Even more so than that first Resident Evil remake, which kept a lot of the same structure and camera angles. Resident Evil 2 basically took the idea that was that Raccoon City outbreak, explore the RPD, Leon and Claire having their own storylines, and really ran with it in terms of what modern hardware could do, what people expect out of the series following the more action era, and really was an introduction point for so many of the modern Resident Evil fans. And truthfully, I think the success of a Resident Evil 2 remake is the reason why we are seeing such a focus on remakes in this modern era, when we see Konami do things like Silent Hill 2 remake, Metal Gear Solid Delta, and the recent announcement of the God of War trilogy remake, which some people are saying is going to be pretty radically different from that fixed camera PS2 era of Kratos adventures. Resident Evil 2 did the exact same thing, because the camera perspective shift was a major selling point, and even a little controversial for some people, but the game delivered regardless. And while Resident Evil 2 Remake is not the first modern-age Resident Evil game that was received favorably by fans, old and new, it really was the game that cemented the Capcom renaissance that we've been experiencing for nearly 10 years at this point. And the game itself is just extremely satisfying to play, with so much to learn, uncover, and is infinitely replayable. I have played through Resident Evil 2 Remake at least about 30 times since it released. The game incentivizes you to, and there are unlocks like the tofu survivor, the hunk run that you can do to reverse your travel through the RPD and escape on the streets of Raccoon City by helicopter. There's so much to uncover in Resident Evil 2 Remake, and the game is just really fantastic. So far, we have covered two eras of Resident Evil. The original fixed camera survival horror angle with Resident Evil Remake, the modern era, the remake era with Resident Evil 2 from 2019. And there is absolutely an era that needs to have a slot in the Definitive 4, and that is the reinvention era with the first-person shooter, or first-person survival horror game, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. Now, I think you could easily make a case for either Resident Evil 7 or Resident Evil Village filling in this third slot on the Definitive 4. Heck, I even kind of prefer Village in a lot of ways, especially its art direction. But Resident Evil 7 is undoubtedly a watershed moment for the series that really defines the overall legacy and history of Resident Evil and Capcom, because where Resident Evil 2 from 2019 cemented the Capcom renaissance, Resident Evil 7 kicked it off. After the extreme lows of Resident Evil 5 and the absurdist co-op, I would say fun, of Resident Evil 6, Resident Evil 7 really recentered on a singular idea. It had focus, it had intent, and it truly made Resident Evil scary again, thanks to its perspective shift, its location in this decrepit southern mansion, and it made the monsters more human. The series, up to this point, was no stranger to making monsters human. I think that initial T-virus zombie and making humans monstrous with Albert Wesker and like Sadler, but Resident Evil 7, the Baker family, they are truly monstrous, and I would say the same for Lady D and her daughters and Mother Miranda in Resident Evil Village. For the majority of Resident Evil 7 that focus on survival horror, the very small number of enemies in that game and the ever-lurking presence of Jack Baker stalking you in that house is truly terrifying. You feel backed against a wall. The darkness in that mansion is just so dark and scary. You really don't know what's in those hallways or those basements. There are great set piece moments. The chainsaw fight, of course, is something that really does scream Resident Evil and the absurdity that these games are known for at times. And Resident Evil 7 also introduced a secondary new era for the series and Capcom, not only with first-person perspective, but also bringing the series to virtual reality, a feat that really not many other long-standing series were able to do successfully. Resident Evil is kind of a pillar of the VR space, at least in the AAA angle of it. The VR side of Resident Evil 7 is not necessarily getting it into this slot, but it is absolutely another feather in the cap of things that Resident Evil 7 Biohazard was able to accomplish. And while we're not factoring it in, the reveal of 7 from the kitchen demo at E3 is also like all-timer. So we have reached the conclusion. One slot remains for the definitive lineup of what best represents Resident Evil. What are the top 4 Resident Evil games that truly scream, this is what this pillar of gaming, of survival horror, of the horror genre is? When it truly comes down to it, what best represents what Resident Evil is, what it can be, what it's contributed to gaming as a whole, only one game comes to mind, truly above all others for the series, and that is Resident Evil 4. The original. To this day, this GameCube game is still a serious contender for many people as like the greatest game of all time. And the thing is, they're right. It is absolutely still worth playing. A little bit of an unconventional camera compared to your modern third-person shooter, but the second you get over it, good lord, this is a truly thrilling adventure, because Resident Evil 4 ushered in the series to action games, and that would lead to some problems down the line, but not on the first go. It also introduced the modern third-person shooter, the language of how we play these railroaded roller coaster set-piece adventures really began the way we understand it today with this game. It still maintained the thrilling horrors of those classic Resident Evil games, only it swapped terror for tension. You are much more capable in Resident Evil 4. You are kind of a superhero with your arsenal, and the enemies leveled up to meet that new threat of Leon S. Kennedy. They are much more aggressive, they communicate, they're intelligent, and there are swarms of them that you have to manage. It's not just a single enemy, a single Crimson Head, or a Licker, or Mr. X. It is a village of people. And as much as I love the remake of Resident Evil 4, truly, I think it's great and stands on its own as another 10 out of 10 in my opinion, it did not have the impact, and really did not do much for the video game landscape the way that we talked about Resident Evil 2 Remake doing, and the original Resident Evil Remake doing. Truthfully, the Resident Evil 4 Remake is kind of just a victory lap. Capcom flexing on everybody for really bringing this classic series back and reminding everyone just how great structurally Resident Evil 4 is. That original is flawlessly paced, really, and going back to it is still a treat. Even if you haven't played it before, like I said, get adjusted to the camera controls and you are in for one of the greatest, most memorable gaming experiences you've ever had. It is a little cheesy, but I feel that is just part of what Resident Evil is. You are going to it for that B-movie storyline. It's thrilling, it's funny, it's extremely memorable, replayable, and at the end of the day, it is just a fantastic video game. And that is what I come to Resident Evil for. That is what makes this series great, because most of the time, Capcom has been able to deliver on all of those pillars, and I believe today that we have laid out the best examples of those pillars. What makes Resident Evil, play these games and find out. And now, with the latest release of Resident Evil Requiem, I'm hoping that we have another contender for one of the GOATs. For now, be sure to let us know what you think of our picks. What games do you feel best represent Resident Evil? Do we need to put more attention on those foundational first attempts at the series? Are we not giving enough love to the Revelations era of Resident Evil? Or are you a big fan of the light gun games? Let us know your definitive for Resident Evil games, and I hope you're having a wonderful time playing Requiem right now. I'm hoping that I am at this point. But for more on Resident Evil Requiem, the series as a whole, and what is going on in the world of gaming, you can stay tuned right here and over on GameRank.com. For now, be sure to let us know what else you'd like to see us rank, and until next time, I'll see you later.